So good afternoon. You're all very welcome to our webinar this afternoon, which is on international trade, specifically looking at export services and certificates of origin. So taking you through this afternoon, my name is Brian O'Farrell. I'm CEO of the County Carlow Chamber of Commerce, and we've got Michaela Riley. If you want to say hello there, Michaela.
Hi everyone, how are you?
So Michaela is with Chambers Ireland. She's Policy and Research Executive. So what I'm going to do is if you do want to pose any questions or comment at all at any stage as we go through the webinar, there's the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen and also the chat function, so feel free to use those. And what we can do is we can cover questions if we spot them as we go along, or indeed we've got some time anyway at the end to do some coverage of that and to cover any specific areas which you might have queries on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover a brief intro on certificates of origin first, and then we'll hand over to Michaela. So first off, about certificates of origin. So what is a certificate of origin is, I suppose, one of the main questions a lot of people will ask. And it's a printed document used by exporters and agents. They're not required for every country, but there's a number of reasons why it would be required, and we will cover that there as well just in a moment. The certificate of origin is basically attesting to where goods are from. So it's like a passport for your goods. And it will be used in a number of scenarios. And there's two main certs that we use. So there's the EU cert. You can see it there on the left-hand side of your screen. And there's the Arab-Irish cert. Depending on the country that you're in as well, the certs can take a slight different format. They're very similar in the layout overall, but there can be a slight differences. Some countries request the certs. It could be customs, banks, exporters, importers. And the reasons that they want them will vary. Sometimes it's to control and verify where imports are coming from. It might be for establishing tariffs and ensuring the traceability of the goods and the origin of goods. And the type of certificate that you need will vary depending on where you are exporting to. So for example, all Arab League nations require the Arab-Irish certificate. And there's a full listing of the countries that require the Arab certificate. If you visit the Carlow Chamber website and go into our export services area, the information is there. But normally for all other countries, it's the EU cert that would be required. Within the Carlow Chamber, I suppose about 96% of all certificates we process are e-certs, or processed digitally. Now, how it works is that basically the actual certificate itself still needs to be printed on a physical document, which was the example I showed you on screen, and we'll show you again there now in a moment, but it needs to be printed on that. But the whole application process, from application through to processing and verification, it's all completed online, which makes it a streamlined and a lot quicker process. Normally we would have digital certs turned around, it could be within minutes to within an hour. It is very rare that there's any time lag on it. Whereas otherwise with full manual processing, you could be, whether you're trying to send them through or having to attend the office, it can be a big time constraint and an additional cost on businesses. And there is no extra charge for processing on the e-certs, but it makes it a lot easier. And it also means that if your goods arrive at a country, that the customs agents at that country can verify the validity of your cert by going online, and they can check the documents that are supporting and attaching to it. Now, before a company can apply for a certificate of origin with County Carlow Chamber, they need to complete an indemnity form, and that's providing a list of authorised signatories to the Chamber. And also, for non-members of the Chamber, we require other details, including a copy of the certificate of incorporation for the company. But most of the companies that we would be dealing with, we would be in regular contact with them. But if you have any queries in relation to that, you can give us a call directly. And would only be countries that are in Ireland that could apply through to an Irish Chamber of Commerce. We couldn't provide certificates for a company outside of the country. And that would be very important because we would need to be able to verify and establish who you are and the products and that as well. So in some cases, there's some of the companies that we would actually be visiting regularly. The process, as I kind of covered earlier on, so the first thing you do is confirm the destination of where the goods are going, because that determines the certificate that you're going to use. Is it an EU cert or is it an Arab Irish cert? You would order blank certificates as required. And what I mean by that, you might ring me up and say, you know what, we've got a number of orders going out. I can send you out 5, 10, however many certs. They don't expire date-wise, so you can keep them in your office for when you need them. Otherwise, we could process them on a full service, which means that you apply and then each time it's sent out to you. It's just that there's a time lag on that, depending on how the post goes. So we'd always recommend having the DIY service. You complete the online application through ASS Cert. That comes through to the chamber. We verify it and work it through and do the necessary stamping, send the approval back to you, and then you print it. Very straightforward. And we've had companies that have just registered with the chamber, and we can have certs turned over sometimes within a couple of hours, depending on how quickly the registration is processed for that company. There's the example of the certificates as I was talking about earlier. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly talk about completing the certs. I know it's probably not clear enough on the screen, but we'll talk about the different boxes, what sort of information goes into it briefly, and just to give you an idea. So box 1 on the cert is the consignor. And this, you need a full name and address, including the country of the exporter. Box 2 is the consignee. So it's the full name and address of the foreign recipient of the goods. And it's very important that the details on this match to the invoice. And this is what we will see as we go right down through all the boxes. So if the consignee is different on the invoice, well, then there needs to be reasoning to it. We need to make sure that the certificate matches the export invoice in a number of ways. Box 3 is the country of origin. And this is very important. So to put in where they're coming from. So if it's a European country, you would normally put European Community Ireland, European Community Spain, depending on where they are. For goods of non-community origin, then the name of the actual country of origin must be used. Area groupings are not acceptable, so you can't put just specific areas like that. It needs to be the actual country. If you have got a shipment going out and the goods are of multiple origins, well then, and depending on the number of goods, what we do is within box 6, as we'll come along further, you can list down the country beside each item, and you can reference that in box 3, the various origins, and you'll have to list off all the different locations where they're from. And I've had that with a number of different exports in the last while, where we've had shipments going and they've totally mixed consignments of various origins, and we have to make sure every individual product is itemized as to where it originated from, because it can have a big difference. Widgets coming from Ireland versus widgets coming from Japan going into South Africa, they could have totally different tariff levels, and it could make a huge difference to the cost on the far side and the import in that as well. So it's important that the information is clear and right, because that in turn can have an impact back onto the exporter. Box 4 is transport details, and transport details is not always required, but it is good to put in there and how the goods are traveling. So whether it's road, air freight, sea freight. You can also put in mixed transportation, because there is a lot of products that travel through a variety of means depending on where they're going to. Box 5, remarks. It's regularly left blank, but it can be used for additional information. Specifically, things like where letter credit details. So if there's a letter of credit number that's been required by banks, so if a bank is requesting the certificate of origin, so we'd normally put details of that in there. So it's referencing the certificate back to that letter of credit and making sure that the customs agents can see where all this documentation connects and how it connects. Box 6 is the description of the goods. And this normally includes very much a lot of detail on the actual goods being shipped. So you'd normally include the item, the number, serial numbers, marks, quantities. So for example, if you were shipping a crate of Guinness, you might put a crate of 12 cans of Guinness, 500 ml. So you would put the different sizes. You could put different notes on it, whether it's to annotate it to that specific crate. You want to ensure that there's clarity in it. And I've had certificates that have come back from different countries because on the far side, the import agents wanted more clarity from the exporters. They wanted to be able to see that this was of a specific product line or specific vintage, depending on beverages, but it's important as well that all the details entered here match to the export invoice. So depending on whatever the products are, and if you do have any queries on it, you can always just pick up the phone and give us a call as well. But the one thing I would say is make sure to put in as much detail as possible, reference it and match it to the invoice, and if you've got any queries, you can give us a shout. I've also had situations where when people are completing the online certs, that they find that, and especially where mixed consignments, where there's a lot of products in it, they found that there wasn't enough space. Again, you can give us a call on that, and we were able to work with ESS Cert, the online portal that we use, to adjust the box to get the full listing and that in there. So there's a number of ways that we can do that, as always. So if you do have any queries that are outside of the norm, it's important to raise them with us as we go along. And box 7 is quantity. So in the gross and net weight in kilos. If you don't know the weights, well then you can put in other identifying particulars, for example, the number of individual items, litres, etc. So there's a number of things there. So that's the main boxes on the certificate. The other 2 boxes would be for chamber use, for authorization, and then on the application stage for verification from your side. But most of that is slightly different now as well, being on the digital system. One of the other important things with regard to an application for certificate of origin is the supporting documentation. And this is very, very important, especially to make sure you attach an exporter's invoice with respect to the goods. And as I've referenced a number of times, the exporter's invoice must match the certificate in the details that are included into it. The other documents that you can attach, and sometimes it depends on the products that are being shipped, whether some of these are required. In some cases, they must be there, and in other cases, they can be as supplements. But at the end of the day, there's no harm in keeping all the details together for it that can assist in the export. So health certificates, bill of lading, airways bill, pack and list, surveyor's quality certificate. These are examples of some additional documentation that you can attach, or in some cases might need to be attached depending on what you are actually shipping. There's a lot more information as well available on the website. So if you visit carloschamber.com and go into our export services section, there is different advice in it there. We've got some of the information we would have covered that's there static on the website as well. But don't hesitate to give us a call at any stage if you do have any queries. I know that some people, sometimes even determining the origin of goods at times can be challenging. Because depending on what you are doing, if you're producing the goods wholly from scratch in Ireland, well then that can be fine. But perhaps you're ordering goods from a number of different countries and assembling. So there's different ways to look at determining origin. And if you, it's probably something that we will cover on another webinar later on. But if you do have any specific queries in relation to it and you are trying to establish the origin properly for the goods, well then don't hesitate to give us a call and we can have a look at all the variables that come into account and we can take that on board. So that's a brief overview of certificates of origin to give you a bit of an introduction. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand you over to Michaela. So we'll let Michaela take it on from here.
Thanks a million, Brian. So as Brian said, our national chambers, we have 33 issuing chambers that can issue certs of origin out of a network of 41. And my job in Chambers Ireland is that I oversee that all of the chambers adhere to the recommendations that are supplied to us from a European level and an international level. So I might just skip on to the next slide there, please, Brian. Great. So as I was saying, we are the largest business organisation. We are also members of the European Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the International Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And why that's relevant here is that, say that you have any issues that Brian might have raised earlier, or if you have issues, I'll go into this a little bit more in depth later, but if you had issues in relation to certs of origin and customs authorities in different countries that we weren't already notified about from our contacts in embassies or the European Commission, we can raise that through the European Chamber of Commerce and the International Chamber of Commerce. And they look into the reasons behind why countries might have gotten a little bit more protectionist, or what are the nuances behind those relationships. So we kind of deal with things on a larger scale, on a European level and an international level. We mainly do that through advocacy and representation. So most importantly, we sit as members of the Eurochambre and the ICC Customs Committee. And most recently, what's I suppose the most relevant would be in relation to COVID-19. We sat on a meeting about 2 weeks ago with representatives from all member states in the International Chamber of Commerce. So, you know, we had people from all over the world, and it was great to hear the disruptions that they had in supply chains, or what was getting, you know, what was a little bit easier for them and what was difficult in the current situation. So we shared our experiences on that, and we've been advocating for specifically Gulf states to accept the electronic certificates of origin, which Brian had mentioned. So we're hoping that, you know, even though this is a very challenging time, that we could perhaps advance electronic certificate of origin so that businesses and exporters have less time constraints and less documentation to go through with, basically, throughout our chambers. And then lastly, we're also a point of contact for all embassies that are here in Ireland, the European Commission, and then customs authorities right across the world. So I might skip on to the next. Lovely. So just to give you some quick stats from our last annual report. So we send this into the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of Business, and we work with them. Again, just if there's any issues that it's highlighted through our stats, they can see the growth in electronic certs, they can see the decline which we've seen in Arab certs of origin. So just you can see there that we've continued growth in the European certs, with over 90% of those issued electronically, whereas we see a decrease in growth for the Arab certs, and just over 60% of those are electronic. So this reflects the limited acceptance by Arab states and the states in the Gulf region of the electronically stamped documents. So we're focusing specifically on that at the minute and trying to advance that with our colleagues in SCERT. So we'll skip on again there. Just to give you a quick overview of Carlo's stats. So overall in Ireland last year, the top 5 destination countries would have been China, Turkey, the UAE, Saudi and Egypt. So that wouldn't have changed a whole lot year on year, but in Carlo, it's a little bit different just because of the export market that you have. So as you can see there, it would be the United Arab Emirates, followed by Turkey, the US, the Dominican Republic and Panama. So that's just to give you a quick overview for yourselves. So then I might just move on to trade policy. So we focus an awful lot on trade policy in Chambers Ireland, and ensuring that protectionism doesn't become, I suppose, any more prevalent in international trade, which it has started to become in the last couple of months. And I suppose you could say since Donald Trump perhaps came into power in the US. So what was very worrying for us was the the WTO Reform and Trade Dispute Mechanism that actually broke down before Christmas in early December, and that's very significant for Ireland because as a country we advocate for rules-based trade, and it's really important that we have these trade dispute mechanisms in place so that if things go wrong, that we have a backup. And when that disbanded, a couple of countries came together, and thankfully that grew and grew. And in January of this year, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Phil Hogan was part of that, and he was one of the leading voices that got this temporary trade dispute mechanism up and running again. So in Chambers Ireland, we're always pushing for that. Last year in our pre-budget submissions, so that was released in September 2019, we also called for an action plan on trade. So it was kind of to make sure that didn't, we were urging the government to make sure that dispute mechanism didn't break down. And even though unfortunately it did, they have engaged again, and they're very active on making sure that we do have an action plan for trade, both at a national level and at an EU level, and right across the board internationally. And this is going to become even more important in light of America's recent, I think it was just over the weekend, Trump had made those remarks about taking pharmaceuticals back to America. So this is it's all very relevant, even though it seems like it's things kind of out of our control. Then just in relation to European free trade agreements. So we have found from doing a good bit of research that SMEs in Ireland don't actually realise the amount of markets that we have open to us. So recently I was working with the Australian Embassy on a current free trade agreement that's being agreed between the EU and Australia, and how that would impact on Ireland. So we're always looking at, obviously it might impact the agricultural sector in one area, but we'd be looking at it from a sectoral position, business, how it would impact businesses, what are the opportunities, and then more specifically for SMEs, how do they engage with that, and how do they find out about tariffs on, specific goods and legislation. And we're lucky that, say, with Australia, they also have a common law system like here in Ireland, but perhaps if we're dealing with Japan or any of the Mercosur countries, that's slightly different. So we're looking at getting a mechanism in place where it's a one-stop shop for all SMEs and larger businesses as is needed, that they can go on, log on, engage with, or get onto ourselves or the Department of Business and see exactly how they can utilise all these free trade agreements. So I might just move on to the next there. Then just to give you 2 examples of market access issues that we would deal with. So an awful lot of the time, exporters might go to Brian or other chief execs around the country and say that they've experienced difficulties with, most specifically recently, Turkey and Brazil, but it could be with any country that they're having a bit of friction with in relation to their exports. So in Turkey, we had a combination of issues last year. So things that customs authorities wanted extra certificates of origin for all goods in a consignment, and they wanted extra export documentation. They were just being a little bit fictitious. So we, through all of our European and international contacts, we raised this issue. We started with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Business, then we brought it onto Europe, and then onto our international colleagues. So we've raised these, and then we found out that other countries are experiencing the same things. So it's very useful for us to have that mechanism, and we can get back to the exporter and say, yeah, look, someone in England has the same thing. So we've gotten onto the Turkish authorities, and we've gotten an agreement in place whereby they only want X and Y instead of the whole alphabet. So we worked on that an awful lot last year. And also in relation to Brazil, I think this might specifically impact an awful lot of exporters in Carlow in the brewing industry for beers and spirits, because what happened unbeknownst to us was the Brazilian Department of Agriculture implemented a system called Siscale, whereby the chamber who had issued a certificate of origin and the exporter had to be registered on this Siscale system before the customs authority would allow the goods to enter the country. But we were never told about that. So we got a lot of complaints, to say that shipments had been held up, and we started to look into this. And through our contacts in the Brazilian embassy here and the Irish embassy over in Brazil, we were able to work with that. And now we've made sure that all of our chambers are registered on it. And we have contacts whereby if you are exporting specifically beers and spirits, but it could be foods as well, that you do get registered on that system as soon as possible to avoid any further delays to consignments. So those are just two kind of issues that would have popped up last year, but you can see kind of the level that we can bring it to and hopefully resolve it quite quickly. So I'll just pop on again there. And then just lastly, kind of to go back a little bit to the European Free Trade Agreements, but here are some just, I find the handiest resources for exporters. And there's a longer list that I can send out, but specifically, so in terms of the market access database, so this gives information to companies exporting from the EU about import conditions in third country markets. So it could be in Turkey about fluctuations there, it could be in Qatar or Brazil, any country at all. And it provides information on tariffs, procedures, and documents that are required for customs clearance or trade statistics, things like that. So it's handy if you're starting out or if you're branching into a new area, just to see what are the rules there before you take on a new business venture or things like that. And the second one is the integrated tariff of the European Community. So this is a multilingual database, which is useful if we don't speak all the languages out there. And it covers all measures relating to tariff, commercial and agricultural legislation. And this gives economic exporters a clear view of what they need to do when importing or exporting goods. So it answers questions like, where do I classify my goods, or what's the legislation applicable to imports and things like that. Thirdly, just is the binding tariff information. So that just gives an EU-wide legal certainty about tariff classification. And then lastly, export and import licensing. So the Department of Business have what's called a licensing unit, and so this provides information about export and import licenses specific to each business. And so those are just four quick overviews, and I think that Brian is going to share the slides and you'll have access to all of those links.
And that's it, I suppose, a quick whistle-stop tour through certificates of origin and export services. So if anybody has any questions that you would like to pose, feel free. You can use the Q&A button on your screen, or indeed the chat function, and we'll work to get the answers. If we don't have the answers straight away, we'll be able to come straight back to you. But ultimately, and I know that today's session has just touched on those areas, but there's a lot more information with regard to international trade. If you visit the Carlow Chamber website, or indeed Chambers Ireland website, you will find links to a lot of different resources that are available to assist you, like the market access database and different resources like that, because I know some of the queries that we would deal with at times might be down to getting the right codes, because if the tariff code is out by one digit for a product, well, that can be a big difference in the tariffs that are applied to the goods, and that can have a big impact back to the company. Also, if you have a wrong tariff code on a product now and you go to amend it, that can send up flags, and suddenly you could have our friends from customs coming down to audit you and query you as to why you've made all these changes. But if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to give us a call at any stage, or indeed just to visit the websites. But I think that's it from us. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. We hope you found it worthwhile, and we look forward to seeing you at some of the next webinars. This Thursday, we've got the next one. We've got Dr. James Ring from Inogen Consultancy and Training, and he's going to be doing a webinar on change management, and that's taking place again at 2 o'clock on this Thursday. So thank you very much. Take care. Thank you.